and welcome. Thank you all for joining this evening for the second event in the Drawing the Line series. My name is Nikki Barber, Vice President of Seattle Print Arts. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of First People of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. Without the land, we would not have access to this conversation, and we thank the original caretakers who are still here. Join us in paying real rent, which goes to support the Duwamish Longhouse and cultural activities. If you are residing outside of Duwamish territory, we encourage you to research the land you're on and find ways to support First People. Links will be put into the chat for you shortly. I'm thrilled to introduce our series discussion facilitator, Cleo Barnett, the Executive Director of Amplifier. Welcome, Cleo. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nikki. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Please drop in the chat where you're dialing in from. It's just a way we can kind of feel like we're together. So my name is Cleo Barnett. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm a visual artist. I'm a public space curator, and I'm the Executive Director of Amplifier. And I'm very honored to be facilitating the conversation tonight with two amazing artists, Kate DeCiccio and Anne Lewis. And I was hoping we could just start with a brief introduction. Anne, do you want to start with just a little bit about what you do?
Sure, yeah. Well, thanks again, Seattle Print Arts, for having us, and Cleo for moderating the conversation. I'm an activist artist living in Detroit. I started as a street artist in New York City, specifically focused on social and environmental justice issues, and that has sort of like become a career, which I was not expecting to have. I've been doing this for like 12 years, but yeah, so I'm in Detroit now, and yeah, I focus primarily right now on women's issues, specifically around sexual assault and sexual violence, and sort of what survivors are going through, and sort of how can I use my practice to support that journey of healing and processing trauma. And yeah, otherwise I've focused on mass incarceration and police brutality in my work in the past, and most of my work is either installation-based work. So I really like to create like immersive installations for folks to really get a full understanding of an issue, or I'm doing it in the public space and doing a lot of community engagement and that sort of thing with large-scale public art, mostly two-dimensional murals.
Thank you. Kate, I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks. Hey everyone, my name is Kate DeCiccio. Thank you, Seattle Print Arts, for having this conversation. I first want to just kind of like name how important it is that we're coming together in community as white people to have these really vulnerable conversations. And so thank you so much for making space for that. I live in Oakland on the occupied land of the Ohlone people. I'm from Central Massachusetts. I grew up on a farm. I come from a family of several generations of farmers. I grew up in the land of the people of Nipmuc Nation. And my work really focuses on portraiture for counter narrative and community storytelling, as well as strategy. I have a background in education and mental health. And I do a lot of work with Performing Statistics as their creative strategist, collaborating with youth organizers all over the country, thinking about what it looks like to increase the impact of their campaigns by including art and the values of cultural organizing. So that's kind of, what my work looks like. But yeah, working on lots of things.
Thank you, Kate. I was wondering if you could share just a little bit more about the why behind your practice. Like, why do you do what you do? And if it's a natural tie-in, like, was there a point when you really started investigating whiteness, or when whiteness was really activated in your work?
Want me to share first?
Yes, please.
Sure. So, for me, I think that always art has been something that really exists. There's like a certain kind of compass that I would say is definitely like in my body, like an inner knowing. And for me, I always had an inner knowing that art was going to be something that supported me to stay well, to find an inner peace at times when there was a lot of chaos around me. And like I said, I grew up in central Massachusetts. I come from a family of farmers. And I also come from Polish and Italian immigrants, as well as 11 generations of English colonizers. So that's the culture of like where I grew up. And also in my family, you know, I saw people struggle as a result of the way that we have socialized. There's mental illness in my family. There's a lot of addiction in my family. And so art was a place that I went to that was like, you know, I just kind of knew that there was power here. And so right away, you know, I went to college, I studied art. I was interested in thinking about what's the role of the artist in community. And particularly, I was really suspicious about the mental health system. So I first started working, teaching art and like collaborating on murals with folks inside state hospitals. And, you know, you start spending time in locked psych facilities in the US, and you really quickly realize that actually the largest psych facilities in the US are prisons. So that was kind of like the route that guided me toward looking at like what becomes possible when artists are collaborating with people who are locked up in institutions, and what's the role of the institution in our society, and how can more collaborative horizontal relationships support people in reintegration. And within that work, I really quickly realized, I didn't, you know, you spend time in American prisons and you immediately realize the ways in which race has informed every moment of all of our experiences, right? And today, my work really focuses on abolition. And today, what drives my work is really thinking about, you know, what does it look like for us to become who we need to be so that our largest abolitionist dreams can come true, right? What if we crave discovery of who it is that we could become, while throwing out, you know, like our grips on this like deep sense of goodness that white people require? And how do we really see this with clarity, and that like this is a roadblock for us? And so I would say that, you know, now my work is really, it is driven by the sense of possibility that lives within abolition. But my curiosity and investigation into understanding how whiteness operates in our world was something that, you know, was first kind of sparked really early on. I had a fellowship in Boston. I was working with kids who were being human trafficked, and I noticed how much they talked about white people all the time. And I realized like, oh, this is a different thing that's happening. White people don't talk about race. And I was with these Black teenagers who talked about race all the time. And I also really noticed how everything they were saying about white people was true. And also, as they said it, I simultaneously was doing some like mental gymnastics to make like, yeah, what they're saying about white people is true, but like, they're not talking about me. And so I began to kind of like have a noticing of the mental gymnastics that were happening for me to try to create distance between myself and claim a narrative of like inherent goodness and like I'm different from other white people. And so that's kind of like when it really started. And that was like very early 2000s. Soon after that, I was working in prisons. And then, you know, that's when I started like, again, it was like 2002, 2003, I started like reading Tim Wise. And really kind of like that was my, you know, starting point of investigating, you know, yeah.
Kate, it's so amazing learning more about your journey. I didn't know all of that pre-working with you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, it's alongside like the goodness of whiteness. It's also like this innocence that comes into play. Anne, do you want to share a little bit about your journey?
It's hard to follow Kate, but I'll do my best. So I was raised in northern Minnesota, which is probably one of the whitest places in the country. So I was raised to not even ever consider race because I didn't have to. And so I think my initial sort of confrontation with my whiteness really came when I moved to New York City when I was like 21. And just kind of got like thrown in the deep end of like the most multicultural, amazing city in the world. And so, like I thought I was doing a lot of work around social justice issues and focusing on diverting kids out of the prison system with the Young New Yorkers, which is a wonderful organization. If folks haven't heard of it, I'll put it in the chat. But basically it's an arts diversion program that helps kids in Brooklyn and I think now Queens not get thrown into the school to prison pipeline. But I think honestly, I moved to Detroit in 2017. And I think my awareness of my whiteness didn't really show up in real life until I'd been here for a little while. Detroit's the largest majority Black city in the country. It's 85% African-American, Black. And as a white activist coming to Detroit, I think I thought like, oh, it's a smaller town. I'll have no problem like integrating into the art scene and all of that. And I think I showed up and I immediately was like, oh, I need to take a big step backwards and I need to sit here and listen. And, I really spent a significant portion of the time that I've been here really examining how, as a white woman, I show up and think that like, I can just like continue doing what I've been doing, which, in New York City, people maybe don't care as much because everybody's doing their own thing. But in Detroit, you can't just like show up in a Black city and like talk about gentrification, like what I was doing in New York, So I'm continually learning here just about like all of the blind spots that I carry as a white woman. And sort of to Kate's point, like, I really reckoned with that I'm a good white person thing because I'm an activist and I protest and all of those things. And, there really isn't such a thing as a good white person. So for me, I think I just, I've been really humbled to be here and to really bear witness to the systemic racism that has perpetuated like the poverty in Detroit, the lack of education, all of the issues that are really affect Detroit because of white flight in the 60s and 70s. Because of, and we're seeing that right now with COVID, the white flight is happening again out of our cities because of COVID. People who have wealth are going to move to bigger spaces. So I'm curious to sort of see how that presents itself in the next few years. But Detroit really is a representation of what happens when there isn't equity in housing, in education, and sort of all the things that I took for granted as a child and where I grew up. So so I know I'm always going to be sort of constantly uncovering and exploring sort of the blinders that I have. And Detroit has really given me such an incredible opportunity to really reckon, I think, with my whiteness in a way that I probably wouldn't have ever done in New York.
Thank you so much for sharing kind of the in-process moment that you're in right now. And I just think this is a really great time to kind of pause and say, anyone who's tuning in right now who has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat, but also to know that this is very much a work in progress that really is never going to stop. And you're always learning something new if you're going to be actively engaged in this work. So just inviting everyone into into flexing that muscle. I know that for myself in the beginning, it just felt like so exhausting. And, you know, it was like, I just felt so like torn apart from doing this work. And now, like 8 years in, it's like, okay, no, this is just, it is uncomfortable, and it's all the things, but it's just something that we're here to do, to shift the way that, to shift things for future societies. And building off of what you're speaking to right now, this is so beautiful that you're like in this work right now. How are you approaching working in community, or how are you approaching being like a community member in Detroit right now? And like, how is that impacting your art practice?
Oh, that's like the question I ask myself every single day. I think, you know, coming here and recognizing I needed to shut up and listen for a long time really made me pause in my work, you know, and I think I beat myself up for a while that I wasn't being the productive artist that I should be, because capitalism has, you know, perpetuated that ideology in my brain. But I've really kind of stepped back and spent a good chunk of the last 3 or 4 years really just like grappling with, how do I create work that I'm passionate about? Mass incarceration, police brutality, whatever, you know, gentrification, all of the things I worked on in the past. You know, how do I do that in a way that's authentic, in a space that really, to be fair, doesn't value what I have to say, because I don't know that lived experience from the people that are, you know, would be viewing my work. And so it really helped me recognize that while those issues are important to me, when you're creating in a city like Detroit, my practice really needed to shift. I really needed to examine, and my work has always been about community. It's always been about other issues. It's never been about myself. Like I don't understand how artists make work about themselves. Like I have a really hard time doing that. And I've had to spend a good chunk of my time here, like really questioning who I am and what, you know, what is my work about? Like, why am I passionate about these things that, you know, affect me, but don't necessarily affect me nearly as much as they affect other people? And so, yeah, I think, you know, it's weird to say this, but I think a lot of my practice in the last few years has just been like actually been able, you know, like learning how to open my ears so that I can actually hear what's happening and I can actually see what's happening, and sort of taking off the layers of my whiteness, of like the lenses that are like embedded in our culture, because that's just like the norm. And really just like getting real with myself that like I perpetuated all kinds of terrible things in my life because I didn't realize that it was wrong. And it isn't so much about like being mad at myself about it. It's about like recognizing that that's where I was, and everybody's on their own journey, right? Like we're all growing in this space at different rates and are at different points. But for me, it's, you know, it's about like forgiving myself and getting over it and keeping going, because you know what, me feeling bad about like being a white person who's fucked up is not helping anybody, right? So I think, you know, I've sort of grappled with self-censorship for sure, especially after George Floyd died. Again, I've worked on these issues for a long time, and I just really felt like it wasn't my place to say anything. It wasn't my place to make banners and make posters for the marches, because my voice can be a supportive voice, but it isn't the voice or a voice that should be centered in it. So yeah, it's, you know, I think it comes down to like the artists are often, you know, we're very much led by ego. I think, you know, the artist brain is really about like my work and what am I doing? And I think being here has really helped me realize like we actually get so much more done when we do it together. So however I can show up in that together space to actually get work done and actually move our society forward is the best way I can show up. So yeah, I don't know. It's not, you know, it's not about me at the end of the day.
Thank you. Yeah, Kate, do you want to share a little bit about your process for working in community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that like Anne said, like this is an evolving process, right? And I think it's also, I think also this is a more valuable conversation if we're also really clear about one of the things that hold us back in whiteness is like this idea that we're meant to show up in professionalized spaces with a sense of like expertise, right? And not only does that hurt us in our practice, but also, one of the ways that white people are really belligerent is that we show up with a sense of, entitlement and intellectualism, and act in really dominant behaviors that exhibit the domination that have perpetuated themselves since the moment that we arrived on this land, right? So I think that always in work, it's a really good coming back to point. It's like, what's the story that I'm most suited to tell? Where's the audience that I should be focused on? Who are the people that I have power to be in transformative relationship with? If I'm learning in one kind of relationship, how do I bring these learnings to other places with the folks who can't be in this kind of relationship? And I think that one thing that I've really been thinking about a lot is, that as a result of working in community and the kinds of collaborations that I have, I'm in working intimate relationship with artists and communities and people of color where I'm like really growing all the time and I'm learning loads. But from that perspective and like from that vantage point, what I really see a lot is a lot of things like what Anne said is that like, some of the biggest roadblocks in our movements are white people who don't know how to get out of the way. And also we're totally creatively blocked. And so I think a lot of our work in community right now that can be the strongest work that white people are doing together is really coming together and having really truthful, honest reckonings with, like, what are the true sources of why we're creatively blocked? And how is the fact that we're creatively blocked as a result of history that we haven't reckoned with because we don't know who we are? How is this dynamic informing the white fragility that makes us unable to show up with true accountability in relationships with people of color? And also, we're slowing down the momentum of movements that are moving into like revolutionary spaces, like, Black and brown and indigenous organizers. They've been healing their imagination. They've been culling in community to focus on like, what are the creative maps that we need to create so that we're 10 steps ahead. So the minute that there begins to be an abolitionist terror, we can, pull this open wide. And so for white people, the best thing that we can be doing is really going inward and mending those creative wounds so that we can show up and be in intimate relationship with a sense of accountability, and also so that we're healed in ways so that we have creative contribution, and that we're really honest about, how it is that we've come to, normalize spaces that completely exist within the containers of capitalism, and we try to translate, those ways of being into movement spaces, and it's, it's terribly harmful. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question that just popped in the chat saying, can you speak to how you build trust with communities of color? How do you know the level of trust you've established? As a brown woman, I've really seen a lot of white folks come in and assume a level of trust that isn't actually there. And their attempts to build trust can be really performative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, one thing is we need to show up and we need to show up long term. and we need to show up and we need to know who we are and be really clear about who it is that we are, what our capacity is. And also I think that to be in relationship in ways that aren't performative are to be able to exhibit a level of accountability. Like I said, like there's going to be fumbles, and part of our commitment to one another needs to be one where we're committed to transformative processes. We're committed to restorative processes. We're committed to owning the harm that we've caused, like from the gate, owning the harm. And that, I think also as white people, one of the ways that we're socialized is that we're socialized to believe that we're only responsible for, like our one individual self. We desperately want to, we desperately want to distance ourselves from the truth of the legacy that we come from, because we have shame about the legacy that we come from. Or we really desperately want to like intellectually hold on to a belief that we're inherently benevolent, we're inherently heroic, and that we're inherently like nice, good working people. And so we, one of the reasons why it's really hard for us to be in, honest working relationship with people of color is because Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are still really hurting from the legacy that we come from. And so when, people are still really hurt, like we can let go of legacy when we've healed the harm of that legacy. And we're not there yet. And so, being able to be in truthful relationship with ourselves enables us to be in accountable relationship with the communities of the people who descend from the people who are the descendants of those who, my ancestors really hurt, and the way that colonization and capitalism are so inherently normalized in all of America, that harm perpetuates itself. So I think that, we'll get deeper into this, but in this conversation about like appropriation and extraction and, what does it look like for white people to truly show up? A lot of ways it's like we have some deep inner work to do. And when we fail and when we can't show up, it's because we're messed up inside and we haven't done the work to be able to show up. And that's work that white people need to do in community, which is why I think conversations like this are super important, because part of white socialization is that our social contract is like, as long as white people are hanging out with each other, we're not holding each other accountable. It's like a sense of, I can trust that if I'm in white spaces, then other white people aren't going to hold me accountable. We're not going to bring up the ugliness that probably collectively we're all carrying. And, one of the greatest gifts that we could give to each other, it was like, what does it look like for us to cultivate spaces where we curiously interrogate the truth of the lies that we've dragged from generation to generation, and we hurt ourselves and we hurt the people around us, and we completely violate the natural world on behalf of great confusion about who it is that we wish that we were, but it's not who we are. So I think that, standing in real truth about who it is that we are is a really important starting point.
Yes. And I'm wondering if you want to add anything to that, but also just want to elevate another question that was in the chat that really ties into all of this about, what's your perspective on reparations and how does that play into your practice or how you move through the world?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't think I can add anything to what Kate said and not just repeat all of her brilliant points. So I'm just going to let that sit in its perfect space, because I think Kate, you're really good at saying the things that I deeply understand in my body and my mind, but I don't know how to articulate. And I really just want to say thank you for the ways in which the work that you've done has allowed you to really verbalize that and really hone in on exactly sort of this thing about whiteness that we just ignore, right? Like it's this whole big elephant in the room that everybody's just like, yeah, it's cool, there's nothing here, emperor's new clothes kind of circumstance. Like I keep thinking about emperor's new clothes and just how America is just like so willing to not look at itself. But in terms of reparations, you know, I really feel like there's it's such a big question on how do you actually heal that? You know, I don't think it's, I mean, yes, I think financially there needs to be some sort of financial reparations, but honestly, the only way that we're going to get to a point where, you know, there's actual equity and actual equality between races is by people doing the work that Kate is talking about. You know, like we can't show up for communities if we are still, you know, allowing ourselves to be under the guise of that we're good white people, right? Like, so sure, there can be financial reparations, and I'm all for that in all of the ways. I think someplace near Chicago, Evanston, Illinois just did it. I don't think it's a perfect solution, but you know, it's a beautiful thing that people are actually doing this and talking about it, and it's not just this like, you know, phantom idea that a couple of years ago was literally a phantom idea. I wrote about this a couple of years ago and it was just like, nobody's ever going to do this. And lo and behold, it's starting to happen. So that's really beautiful to me. But I think the real work that we have to do is reckoning with the fact that we've allowed ourselves and for generations to be okay with the, you know, vast disparities, and just look the other way and allowed ourselves to just pretend that, you know, this is just the way things are and I'm just one person and I can't do anything to change this, and really, you know, start doing the work on an individual level. Because again, like America, as much as I hate that we're like very much pushing this individualism, like it does have to start with each of us. You know, we can do it in community, and I think that's, again, these kind of conversations are sort of how that can instigate and start rolling. But we really do need to look inward and recognize, you know, the harm that we cause knowingly or unknowingly is absolutely something that we need to reckon with and understand and continue to challenge. And I think, you know, it's always this work in progress, but I really worry that, you know, how long would it take to get to a point where, you know, we're not perpetuating all of these, you know, social norms that capitalism perpetuates, that our, you know, republic perpetuates. I'm not going to call it a democracy. It's not, you know, there's so many levels to the institutions that I think, as we're seeing it sort of happen in these small towns, that's great, because I think people there have been realizing that they need to show up differently. So how do we encourage people to just show up like that, but also to start really doing the work within themselves to recognize how they're participating in all of this, how we're participating in all of this.
Do you want to add anything to that, Kate, or?
No, I mean, I think that Anne pretty much nailed it. And that, like, you know, financial reparations, absolutely, all the ways. And also we've got a lot of other work that we need to do too.
Well, speaking of which, I'm wondering if you can kind of dive into one of the meaty questions of, you know, what's the link between the extractive nature of white supremacy and colonization, and then cultural appropriation with white artists?
Well, I mean, I think that one thing that's really important to talk about, before we talk about extraction, I think we also need to talk about erasure. And, you know, like, what's the legacy of the press in North America amongst white people? And the legacy of the press amongst the North America, in North America amongst white people is that the first press that came to North America was used to translate the Bible into Algonquin in Massachusetts so that John Eliot could violently convert Native people in Massachusetts in a place where the options were, if you're found to be practicing any kind of traditional religious ceremony, you could potentially be, killed, or you convert to Christianity. And look, we translated all these Bibles into indigenous languages. So that's our legacy of the press in North America. And so I think that like all of us as printmakers, when we think about how we want to create healing with our tools, who we want to be as printmakers on this land, knowing the legacy of the press, we have some work to do. And in the same way that, we claim narratives that aren't true, we also claim a passive role in a lot of the violence that we come from. Conversion to Christianity is an act of violence. It's a violation of the spirit. It's a violation of people's cultural identity. And when you rape people of belonging in that kind of way, it's the deepest violation of a person's kind of humanity. And we need to take a deeper sense of accountability and responsibility for like what that really means. So when we talk about colonization and we talk about white supremacy, we must understand these things within like, these things all are in the service of capitalism. Colonization, we get sold this tale like that colonization was a spiritual endeavor. Colonization was a capitalist endeavor. And in many ways, I'm going to speak to colonization in Massachusetts, where I come from. The spiritual endeavor that was pursued through the kind of Christianity that was, most pervasive in Massachusetts was Protestant Christianity. And what was a line that everyone was fed was that like, to be in close relationship with God was to be working. And in Massachusetts to this day, I come from a place where like, you could only hope at your funeral that someone would say, she worked till the day she died. Like that's the greatest thing that you could be. And that your value as a person is equitable to your capacity to produce labor. And so we did that to ourselves simultaneously. And when you internalize that, that's how you begin to make space for the justification of slavery. All that is ableism, when we think about like all of the ways that we devalue people who don't produce labor, that's where that comes from. And we did that to ourselves first. And we continue to do that to ourselves. And capitalism makes sure that we feel comfortable doing that to ourselves. So, first off, we need to get really clear on the ways in which we are in relationship with our body in a way that is in relationship with labor. And when you reduce yourself to only your labor, then you have to be in a kind of relationship with your body where you're down to override the truth of what your spirit wants. You're down to override the aspirations of your humanity, your creativity, like there's no part of capitalism that's like, how do we make sure that these healthy spirits are able to feel connected in the larger, most magnificent natural world and in deep loving relationship with other humans so that they're dreaming beyond what they can see in their lived life? There's no room for that in capitalism. So So then when we as artists have to live in capitalism and try to exist in capitalism and make art in capitalism, and also we as white people don't know who we are. So our working practice with connection is severed. So it should make sense to us that like, oh, well, how come white people are appropriating all the time? There's a couple questions here. It's like, why are white people so damn hungry to be in proximity with those who have well spirits, even if those creative spirits are completely disconnected from the cultural identity of white people? But also, how come white people like say they're like going for inspiration, but it like looks like shopping? And it's because largely white people, we've internalized capitalism as though that's our identity. And we perform our identity in lots of ways like that, right? You know, like capitalism tells us like, oh, you could be this, or you could be this, or like buy this, put this on, decorate your house like India, and then you could be that. So, you know, like these things are all very connected. And yeah, we got a lot of work to do. I'm gonna turn on the light in here because it's getting dark. Anne, you wanna talk?
Oh my gosh, Kate, I feel like I'm like at church right now.
Yeah, I know. It's always like, what do you say after Kate speaks? I'm just not quite sure. But I think, you know, to your point about like, it's really, we've been all very much socialized to be consumers, right? And because we are white Americans, you know, what is our culture but like Elvis Presley, who stole the culture of our Black community? What are we, like hamburgers and French fries? They're French fries, you know, like there's everything about our culture is pulled from somewhere else. And sure, you know, we're a country of immigrants to an extent, not all of us. But, you know, I think like the mentality here is like, and it's just been embedded in, you know, the individualism that had like permeated the colonies and all, you know, so many people that came here. It was just that like, I have to get ahead no matter what. I am fighting for me and my family to stay alive and to survive. And it's really coming from, you know, I spent a lot of time looking at where we are on like the human spectrum of time, and, you know, where were we like 2,000 years ago versus where we are now, and how have we evolved as mammals, right? Because really, like, it's all about like maintaining our own, our brains are still at the point where it's like, okay, I need to make sure I don't get eaten by a lion. So I'm just going to protect, you know, this group of people because this is all I can do. Instead of, you know, evolving with the way our cultures have sped up and, you know, become so integrated. You know, we still really operate from that lizard brain of just like survival mode. And, you know, because we're coming from a place of privilege for the most part, it's like, okay, well, I don't have it as bad as that guy, so I'm cool, I'm good. Like, you know, I don't need to worry about their problems. Those are their problems because, you know, we're still surviving here. But capitalism has really pushed that to, I think, to a really intense breaking point of just, you know, we're unable to really reckon with the fact that we don't really have an identity. And so this consumption of other cultures that have been developed in response to our white dominance, right? This myth of white supremacy, you know, so much, if you think about jazz, if you think about all of these artistic movements, it's really been in reaction to stepping away or like moving from, you know, this really desolate, empty culture, right? That's those movements have really just been like, fuck all of that crazy white shit. Like, we're focused on who we are as a people, and we're there using our art forms to heal ourselves from all of the horror that we white folks have caused people. So, you know, I think there's a weird sort of like I think a lot of white folks tend to like consume and absorb other cultures because we have shame and guilt, because we recognize that we're part of the reason that all of this shitty stuff has happened to countless cultures, countless people. I mean, it's not just in America, right? Like if you look at our foreign policy, you look at how many children in Yemen have died from the US policies, you look at Iraq, Afghanistan, all of these spaces, and those are just in the last 20 years, like we have perpetuated so much death and destruction across the entire planet. And, well, like the Afghani, weaving is so super cool. So like, I'm just going to incorporate that into like the pattern in the background of my work, because I think it's cool. And I want to, talk about how I really respect that culture, but like, we are perpetuating so much destruction in that space. And again, like nobody's really taking responsibility for the fact that, we all participate in that. And there's really, what are we doing to fix that? Nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like opening spaces for these types of conversations, I know we've said it before, is like definitely part of the process. Flexing that muscle, learning how to have these kinds of conversations. So one question that was kind of inspired by last month's conversation with Greg and Tracy was, what do you do when you see cultural appropriation? Like Kate, you were speaking to like, how do we call each other in? Like, how do we have these challenging conversations? I know that's something that I've really valued in my relationship with the two of you, is like being able to like have that safe space to have those challenging conversations. So yeah, like, when you're trying to create like an inviting, inclusive, non-judgmental community, what do you do without like triggering like an offender from like withdrawing from the community? Is that even a priority? Like what? Yeah.
Hear all of that. And I think, I think the first thing is, for us to really think about how do you create spaces? Well, no, first of all, I'm like, what do I want to say first? I think it's really important for all of us as white people to have like a real, like, okay, we're here together. There's 48 of us here right now. All right. We as white people first need to step into a place of, look, sometimes I've felt really uncomfortable when I felt like I've done something wrong, and I don't feel like the people who are calling me out are going to love and appreciate and see me for like my humanity. If I like step into ownership, or I feel really scared about what it might mean about me if I begin to imagine really truly like, oh, I really fucked up. And also, we as white people must understand the ways in which, because of our power, we have moderated conversations where we feel uncomfortable and shut down conversations when we feel uncomfortable. And particularly white women, we have named those conversations as unsafe. And we are not unsafe, we are uncomfortable, and we are filled with fear. And, definitely we're filled with fear, and we're filled with anxiety, and we're filled with, we behave the way that we do, and we're filled with anxiousness the way that we are for a reason. And it's largely, again, goes back to that we are carrying a lot of stories and a lot of trauma that is part of our legacy and that we have inherited that we haven't dug into. Our bodies know exactly what's going on. Our heads want to convince us of a lot of other things, but our bodies know what's going on. So also we must, to get like, to really gain grounds in this, like part of this is that like, we as white people are gonna have to all do a lot of somatic work to like work on like the nervous system code red, where we're not in danger and we are pressing the eject button because we feel uncomfortable, and because for the last bazillion generations we got to press eject. It's not helping us. And so like, look, like tonight, let's all just be like, okay, I'm down to feel really uncomfortable, and work in my body of like not coding that as being unsafe, because we need to be able to develop the kind of resilience so that we can grow in ways that are super important. So that's one. And doing that in community and in relationship, where you can be like, hey, like, you know, I know that I saw initially you asked this question. It was like, oh, there's a person on here and they're like part of a print group and they're like trying to develop an inclusive space, but like appropriation has happened, and like, how do they like talk about this and blah, blah, blah. And I think also, again, you're like, and how do you like call out the offender? I think that also is a moment for us to kind of like be a little bit curious about like, God damn it, in white socialization, we're still like, that's the bad guy, this is the offender, they fucked up, blah, 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 versus like, all right, in this white family of fuck ups, we need to have a loving relationship. Like, okay, we messed it up again. Okay, we got to call this person in. We got to get this right. But also, like, I also wonder, like, what does it look like to build community where we're collectively interrogating the stories that would help us to know ourselves well enough so that we're not fumbling in those ways? Because I also don't necessarily know that like I saw you steal that Japanese woodcut and now it's in your work. And like, I don't know how helpful that is, but more like, what does it look for like for us in community, and like, you know, be accountable. Like, what does it look like to make a contract like in your printmaking community and be like, hey, let's like have like a white interrogation group. Like, let's be like white detectives and like, let's get to know ourselves. Let's really know the legacy of like the print making that we come from. Let's really get curious and suspicious of the hero narratives that we've internalized. Let's really think about like, what's the imagery that I can incorporate in my work that really is about what I come from, or really is about the stories that like I want to repair. You know, like how can we get really curious together and do it in ways where we're sharing the things that we're discovering? Because I feel pretty confident that like those of us who, you know, have shopped for inspiration and appropriated work, you're not doing so because you're like trying to hurt other people. You're doing so because you don't know how, you don't have a practice of digging towards authentic inspiration. And that's something that we need to work on together. You know, like it's a practice, it's a muscle. And I think that, you know, the relationships that are the most fruitful in my life are definitely the creative ones. And, you know, to be in relationship with other artists and be like, what are you working on? Or like, what inspires you? Or what do you do when you feel like hell and people are commissioning you to make posters about, you know, the wonderful future. It's really important to have those relationships. So, you know, I would say that, it's kind of both a give ourselves a break and we need to go all in all together. But I think that explicitly, we also need to look at the ways in which a currency of white socialization has been, you know, ostracization, isolation. So, you know, we're scared because we know what's at stake, and white people are great at throwing other people out, you know, like, so we're rightfully scared that we're going to get thrown out, because in community, we show each other over and over again that we're going to get thrown out. So like, what does it look like for us to crave sharing with one another, you know, our discoveries of who it is that we really are and the stories that we're realizing that we're absolutely suited to tell. Like, I love how Adrienne Maree Brown talks about how like in this room right now, there's a conversation that could only happen here, like only between these people. what's that conversation between like you and, you know, the other printmakers that you feel close with, and how do you cultivate conversations in your community, where everyone is tasked with the responsibility of, you know, really getting honest with their work and with their inspiration, and how they're refinding connection. You know, because that's like a really big piece of this. It's about connection and creativity. It's spiritual work. So we can talk all day long about it, but it's also, it's in your body work, which is hard when you're a white person. And what has served us is for us to detach and only live in an intellectual space. But that, I would argue, is the space from which our violence comes. Like that deep, I mean, and that's another thing too for us to like talk about together, is like that deep sense of like ungrounded, untethered, unknowing sense of lostness, while you're simultaneously feeling like that you are to perform like, I got this and I can stand on my own 2 feet on top of the windy hill by myself, not eating anyone, and I'm slam dunking capitalism. So, you know, let's like get in there. Yeah.
Thank you, Kate. Your words are medicine for us. So I know, you know, we only have 4 more minutes technically of this conversation. I feel like it could have gone a lot longer. I do have one more question if you both are okay with staying for a little bit over time. But before I ask, I just want to say thank you so much to Seattle Print Arts. You all have been so thoughtful in curating this panel and so intentional about this conversation series, and have been amazing to work with. Alongside these panel discussions, there's also going to be a like more intimate discussion group that's going to happen next Wednesday. And it's going to be facilitated by Seattle Print Arts board members, Amber Chiozza and Sarah Maker. Chiozza, sorry, Amber Chiozza. And the information is going to be emailed to you all. So we hope that you'll join us. And yeah, the information's just popped in the chat. And so, you know, this is a little bit of an improv question here, but building off of something that was pre-planned. I was just wondering if you all have any like specific healing that has helped you get in your body and helped you kind of with your own personal healing journey. And then also, like, how do you connect with ancestors through your work? Yeah.
And you.
Yeah, we'll start with you, Anne.
Something tells me that Kate has a really good answer for this. I don't necessarily know if I do. I think I've really shifted who I'm really trying to embody or pull from and understand from and learn in terms of my back history and my ancestors, specifically through the women in my life, the women in my family. There's just so much silence in terms of how women have existed in this world and sort of what we've all gone through, or the stories that we don't tell our children or our siblings or our grandchildren, because, you know, again, this white idea of like success and capitalism, and, you know, you don't tell the bad stories, you don't talk about your problems. There's this perpetuation of silence. There's this perpetuation of not wanting anyone to know your business, which not only perpetuates the myth of white supremacy, but it also perpetuates like horrific patriarchy, and sort of all of the knock-on effects that come with you know, white male dominated societies. And so I think, like, as I'm sort of looking at sexual violence as, you know, this really massive issue, you know, and I look back to the stories that I have somehow gleaned from my family, and I look towards the future, and I understand sort of where we are now, right? And my brain really wants to go to how do you create a future without sexual assault? Like, what does a world even, how can we even imagine what that's like? How can we imagine how different our lives would be if women didn't have to spend time worrying about which streets they walk down and who's going to be at the party, if they need to worry about, you know, pick an issue, pick a thing, like just being a woman in this world is, you're constantly registering threat alerts, right? And so like what do our brains do when we're not having to constantly be in this state of anxiety, stress, fear, etc.? Like, who would we be? How would we be different? What would we do with all of this time? And so I'm really sort of recognizing the labor that women have done for generations and generations and generations, you know, unappreciated labor that is, you know, invisible to so many folks, and seeing sort of how that labor has then shifted in towards where we are now, but also how do we go forward and consider what we would do with that time and that labor, that energy, that emotional energy, that physical energy, in a future when we didn't have to necessarily manage all of that at once. So
Yeah. Did we lose Cleo?
I think so.
Oh, well, I guess I'll finish. Oh, I'll share my answer. Hopefully she'll pop up. The question is, what's work that's helped us? And also,
Yeah. How do you connect with your ancestors through your work?
So I would say, what's work that helps us get in our body? Well, I would say a lot of things for me. One of the things is definitely coming into a truthful relationship around busyness, and understanding the way in which the compulsion to be working all of the time was not actually anything that was connected to my moral fibers, the way that I had internalized that sensation. So slowing down, huge, because slowing down demands that you sit with yourself. And when we sit with ourselves, we have the capacity to, you know, be in a conscious kind of like, oh, this is what's going on in my body. This might be the source of this. That I, you know, and now I'm in really clear relationship with, you know, like, I know the places in my body that hold the pains of the things I've internalized about myself that I need to be working on, as well as the things that my ancestors internalized about themselves that weren't resolved because I walk around with them. So a huge thing that like really changed me, I was doing work with Chip Thomas as part of the Painted Desert Project, and he introduced me to Dr. Ruby Gibson, who wrote the book My Body, My Earth. And so through the practice of somatic archaeology, I've really been able to unpack like a real helpful sense of you know, understanding the depth of disconnection that has lived in my body for many generations. And also begin to transform that. So, you know, I do a lot of breath work. I do some meditation. I run a lot. So those are things that have all been super helpful to me. And, you know, in the more that I grow in a sense of awareness in my body, I grow in a sense of awareness of the way that my mind can be a tool of manipulation. And the way that the mind has been a master manipulator of white people to convince us, you know, the ways in which that we should be working on behalf of capitalism. So that. As far as connection with my ancestors, you know, I feel like that a big part of my work, especially like in the last year or so, I've been like really digging into my ancestor shit. And I come to that work from a place of like, you know what, if this was like so great for all of us, then like I wouldn't be feeling like this. If this was like working out for us well, then like maybe people in my family wouldn't be drinking themselves to death. If this was working out well for us, we wouldn't have rampant like you know, obsessive compulsive neuroses and anxiety disorders. So I feel a sense, like with my ancestors, I feel a sense of like, no, they want like they want me to do this work because they got hindsight's 2020, they say, right? So like I feel like that I think about this work as an opportunity to do a kind of healing that like they didn't find the self-respect to dig into. And you know, I think that in the same way, like I don't want to step into like the real darkness of the reality of my ancestry, like just so that I can further, you know, berate myself, which is like, you know, so like negative self-talk is a pretty white thing to do. So I'm interested in doing the work that is like, no, like let's indulge in self-respect. Let's indulge in like a truthful understanding of what we come from so that we can embrace the power to heal forward. And like, let's not pass on these self-destructive behaviors to the next, you know, like I have 3 nieces and a nephew, and if they don't internalize the same shit that I have about how they're supposed to be engaged with labor and white supremacy, like I would feel like a great ancestor. So, and the other thing is you know, when I really get close to my ancestors, I think a lot about the way that the ancestors who, when I knew them and when I think about them and feel them, and in our family, there was like a lot of shame and unacceptance, mostly because of drug use. I actually really try to have a different kind of relationship and imagine it like that, like their spirits needed something else, and the world that they were asked to live in wouldn't withstand what their spirits needed. And so they, you know, they found self-soothe. This is not a pro drug and alcohol. This is like, their spirits hurt so badly that they found a sense of soothe by drinking themselves to death. And I want to be an ancestor so that like a spirit like mine and a spirit like theirs gets to live and be well. So I also try to really feel like the complex pain of my ancestors, and imagine what it looks like for me to step into the power to like transform who I am so that I can stand as like a sense of possibility for the next set of, you know, little creatures in my life.
Thank you so much for sharing those tips and tricks. My internet kind of cut out and now I'm on my cell phone, so I missed a little bit of it, but it will be a good excuse to come back and see the recording online. Thanks so much, Kate and Anne. I really appreciate your time and sharing with us. And thank you so much again to Seattle Print Arts for making this platform possible. And you know, I hope to continue the conversation with you all next Wednesday. I'm really looking forward to continuing to deep dive into this. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.